Well, welcome, Nancy, and thank you so much for joining me for this first In Conversation with series of discussions around STEAM education. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to introduce you to everybody who might watch this video. So Nancy is Director of Learning and Participation at Birmingham Contemporary Music Group and has worked with the group since 2000. Nancy studied trumpet at the Royal Northern College of Music and has an MA in Community Music from the University of York. I know that Nancy is passionate about creating opportunities for young people to compose, perform and listen to new music. And in particular, she's interested in developing the pedagogy and practice of composing with young people. Nancy has real insight and expert music knowledge, and it's my absolute pleasure to chat with her today. Thank you for joining me, Nancy.
I'm absolutely delighted to chat. It's really lovely to revisit work we did together for many years ago and still doing.
Excellent, thank you. Now, there is one particular project that I'd really like to talk to you about today in relation to STEAM education, and that's Resolution, which brought together composers and biomedical scientists to work with young people to create new music around the theme of autoimmune disease. I hope I've got that correct and in a nutshell, but do you want to just give us a kind of brief outline of the project, Nancy?
Yeah, sure. So Resolution was our second project funded by the Wellcome Trust, and they had an arts grants scheme which was about enabling public engagement in science, in particular in biomedical science. The previous project was called Resonance, and we've worked with a group of scientists at the Henry Wellcome Centre for Nuclear Magnetic Resonance at the University of Birmingham. And that has been very interesting, but I felt there were still things to explore, things that have been learnt from that project that I wanted to, and so I wanted to do another project to revisit some of these ideas and take them further. So Resolution, would you like me to talk about why it's called Resolution? Is that helpful?
Sure, yeah, because I was going to ask you about that word resolution because it has meaning to both scientists and composers in the music field. So please do talk about that.
Yeah, so resolution is a musical term, is about when you go from a dissonant chord or different dissonant sound to a consonant sound. And so, in chord progressions, it's that sort of ending that you hear and it feels like the piece is finished or the chord sequence is finished. So that's resolution in music. And in this rheumatoid arthritis, which is this autoimmune disease, my understanding is that it is when the symptoms are resolved before it becomes a chronic inflammatory disease. And the word resolution is used to describe that. So in the project, we built three teams of composers, scientists, and teachers in 3 Birmingham secondary schools, working with I don't think it was always Key Stage 3. Some of them might have been GCSE groups as well. So 3 different schools in Birmingham, and the idea was to use music to both illuminate science to the young people and to the wider public, and also to use the science as a stimulus for composing new music.
Excellent. So the word resolution is common to both science and music, but would you say, or was there any similarities or differences in the creative processes of the composers and scientists as part of the project?
Absolutely. I think it's worth saying there were 2 different kinds of composers taking part in the project, and they worked in pairs. One was a more experienced composer, and the other we called a shadow composer. The lead composers were there to work with the young people to use the science as a starting point for the young people's own composing. Whereas the shadow composers were there to create a new piece for the young people to play. So they had a slightly different role. And then the scientists, they were all from a centre at the University of Birmingham, and they were all quite young, emerging professional scientists. And I guess if you're looking at their creative process, for them, it was probably, well, in terms of the project, about how they took their quite complex science and explained it to the young people, but also supported the composers in what they were trying to do with the young people as well. I think we'll probably get onto this later, but there are lots of similarities in terms of thinking processes that both scientists and composers might do. But that's what I'd say sort of happened within the project.
Okay, so could you unpick a little bit further for me then? So what was the role of the composing and music making? Was that as important as the science? So was music and science on par with one another? Or, for example, did music serve the scientific learning?
It was a music project, I think. And in some ways, it's interesting, because the children were being told, and the composers were being told, that they had to use this particular science as their starting point for their musical creation. But the scientists had to modify very much how they taught the children the science. And that was possibly to do with the kind of limits in the time that was available. So I think there was one very introductory full-on science lesson, when I say lesson in the broadest, most exploratory type of way. And then there would be a bit of science in each session, which would set off the musical ideas for the day. So in some ways, the science was serving the music, but the music being created was being structured around the parameters of the science topic.
So would you say they were hand in hand then, or was music the kind of main subject area?
I think music was the driver. I mean, our collaboration was with the music teachers rather than the science teachers. And that's an interesting question, because that's quite challenging as well. Of course, our contacts are the music teachers, and not necessarily the science teachers, and that's certainly something to reflect upon. But it was presented to the schools as a music project.
So this was an in-school music project, and it was with secondary age young people. And often in the secondary phase of education, subjects, in terms of the architecture of the school, subjects are siloed into particular areas. And in some schools, secondary schools, interdepartmental collaboration can be quite difficult. And we know it can also be quite difficult because of timetables as well. Did you find there were any challenges in the interdisciplinary working within this project?
Absolutely. Gosh, there's so much in there. I think so. It worked really well in one particular school, and that was probably because they had an overarching approach to learning, or as part of the curriculum, which comes out of the Guy Claxton work about building learning power. And so there was a kind of overarching idea about creative thinking, and therefore in that school those links were able to be made. On the opposite end of the scale, when one of the visiting scientists asked to borrow equipment from the science department of one of the schools, they said absolutely no. So you sort of had this real extremes of a kind of learning culture in one school, that idea of creativity being embedded across between the arts and the sciences, and the other, you can't even use the equipment. And I don't blame the school at all. It was about the structure of the project and how schools operate, maybe some of our lack of understanding about how schools operate. And then just, I think one of the biggest things is curriculum time. um, and teachers being willing to give up curriculum time, and on our side to understand that that's very difficult for schools to give up curriculum time. The Wellcome Trust funds projects to look at biomedical science, and that may not be on the curriculum, and so it's not on people's radars. Had we been able to set up a project where we truly looked at the science curriculum of the school and the music curriculum of the school, in particular the composing aspect, and really found synergy from the start with the science teachers and the music teachers in the room, all together with the composers, that would have been different. But we might not have got money for that project because this money came from the Wellcome Trust. So there is this, there's the funding parameters you're working around as well as that jostling for space within the timetable, and silo working as you describe as well. It was interesting in the first project, when we worked with the Henry Wellcome Centre at the University of Birmingham. I met the director of that centre was a very is a keen musician, or he certainly, all the main scientists in that building were also musicians. And there's an immediate sort of understanding about creativity and science, and he said he looked for scientists who were musicians because he felt like they thought differently. So that when I made that first approach, having such a positive context for that to happen. There were problems in that project as well, and in the schools that we worked with, and actually we didn't work with schools, we worked with a private string ensemble group in that case. But even then there were still conversations. So for example, the scientists were quite traditional classical musicians. So our kind of contemporary, even though we're contemporary classical, those approaches were quite very different from, I think, what those scientists expected. So you can't, even when scientists are musicians, you can't always expect they're necessarily to be understanding either. I think it's far more likely you find scientists who are musicians than you do music teachers who maybe are interested in science. I think these things are all really, really interesting.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to untangle that a little bit further about the relationship to music. And I know a lot of scientists who are also musicians as well, and I think that you started to pick up on there, the questions of, are there similarities in the creative process between something like the sciences and doing research in science to making music to working within the arts? You did mention that one of the schools, as part of the Resolution project, was thinking about building learning power and the notion of creativity. Did you notice any kind of creative links between music and science within that school? Did anything arise from that project that made you think that there might be a connection between music and art, or were there distinct kind of creativities between the two subjects?
I think, and it's a long time ago, but I think there are massive similarities between the process of composing and doing science. I think there's a myth about composers, that they're suddenly inspired from heaven and they get this wonderfully formed idea, and that forgets about the craft, the practice, the daily repeating of practices and habits. And on the other hand, we see scientists as being, purely about data and facts, forgetting that it's in those sort of moments of inspiration that new discoveries are made, and that ability. And I think what they share at a high level, and what I suppose we're trying to encourage in their children, is, I suppose it's about possibility thinking. So when you've got an idea, a musical idea, you can think of all sorts of different ways that you might take that. And the same goes for the scientist. And it's that about being able to generate multiple possibilities from a particular idea and imagine and take those along a line of inquiry.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what, that's in there in the Guy Claxton's work. I think the big thing, what I remember the teacher there telling me, I mean, I've read all the Guy Claxton books, but I have to say it was some time ago, about building in failure into every lesson. And that the teacher was working in a particular school where they had realized they were very good at filling their students with facts and knowledge, but actually working with those facts and being creative, those facts, being resilient in the learning was something they found more challenging at that school. So that's why they'd looked at this particular way of working, and the idea to fail. And again, I think that really connects with the composers. Just that sort of working at ideas and it not always turning out right and generating new ideas. I think there's a real link there.
So what about the young people who are part of the Resolution project? What do you think what did they tell you their experiences of this collaborative project between music and science? What was their overall perceptions of both of the subjects post the project?
I think some commented that, well, many commented that they'd really enjoyed this. They didn't like science at school, but they'd really enjoyed the science in this project. Others, some of the teachers commented that they thought it was too complicated. It was too complicated, the science, though that isn't borne out in the young people's comments, though there wasn't a massive sample of young people that actually commented at the end. But yes, this is completely different from the science I do in school. This has really brought it to life. I wish all my science lessons were like this. I've learned more in these few sessions than I've done in all my science curriculum. And I remember there was one particular comment about the kind of just practical, real life quality, and maybe that's actually having scientists in school doing science. I mean, we think a lot about visiting artists, but we very rarely talk about visiting scientists going into schools. And we had a fantastic science educator supporting those scientists going in as well. So yeah, I think, and in terms of the composing element, a lot of the young people, I think just it opened, though in some ways it's restrictive because they had to compose about the science. That was it. It wasn't about using their own ideas. Of course, there was a lot of freedom to interpret those ideas themselves, but the idea that you could take starting points from outside of music, outside of genre, as a catalyst for your composing. So taking the notion of your musical idea being a cell that goes on a journey and transforms, and it interacts with other agents which transform it in some way and turn it into something else, which is then meets something else and then is resolved, if you like, if we're going back to sort of resolution. So though the science was quite complex, it did offer a massive number of parallels in terms of kind of processes that the science was talking about, all these kinds of processes which were really rich in terms of giving ideas for generating ideas, selecting which ideas you take forward, how you might transform an idea, how you might add ideas together. So the science was really offering the children through the science language, a whole way of developing musical ideas. So in some ways, they had this quite complex science, but it did have a huge richness about how to transform and develop musical ideas and how to structure them as well.
What about the partnership between the composers, the scientists and teachers? So there are all these professionals working on this project. Did the project have any impact on their own professions, their ways of being, thinking and doing at all?
Yes. But yes, I think for the scientists, they had some really solid CPD. I think from Hannah from Arthritis UK, and that so they, the scientists had never done any of this kind of work. So for them, learning how to translate very complicated ideas into simple but meaningful learning for the children, I think there was a massive learning curve for them. For the shadow composers, I think it was, writing to a brief, a very particular brief where they had to use a particular bit of science, and also they had to compose music that could be played and performed by young people. So I think there was a huge amount of learning there. The teachers, I think it gave them, some real ways in which they could use extra musical ideas to stimulate composing within their curriculum, and also, if even if we didn't achieve it, how they might go to their science department and create a co-project, across the disciplines. I think that's what it gave to them. With the lead composers, I don't know. I was trying to think about that, really. I don't think any of them had ever worked with scientists in quite such a collaborative way. So maybe for them, it was about how to collaborate in the classroom in a meaningful way that gave space for both the science and the musical ideas. And it was about them translating the science into something musically meaningful for the children. I mean, though it's quite unique, I guess, for scientists and composers to be working with young people in schools, it isn't so unique for composers to use scientific ideas to generate musical ideas. I mean, that's been done for years, and is one of the reasons, I guess, why I sort of thought the project would work, because I knew quite a few composers who were excited by science. At the moment, BCMG is involved in a project with the Royal Northern College of Music, and it's going to be a music and maths focus. I think probably there's a Greek composer called Xenakis, who was both a mathematician and a composer, and I think he was an architect as well. And I think for a long time, music and the sciences were much more connected. Scientists were often interested in the mathematical properties of music too. Sorry, I'm not sure that totally answered your question.
No, but you've gone off on a really nice kind of direction there. You've worked with young people for a very long time now, exploring, developing their composing processes. And you've worked right across the age phases as well, from early years right the way through to secondary. Now, you were talking there about that composer in terms of maths and music, working in that way. In your perspective, is there a difference between the types of young people that you work with from early years right the way through to secondary education? Is there a difference in the way that they can join like STEM subjects with the arts? Is there something about secondary education that's different to other phases, perhaps? I mean, resolution was in secondary school, and we've talked about some of that interdepartmental collaboration that can be quite difficult. What's that like across the other phases of education?
Well, that's really interesting, and something I'm particularly thinking about at the moment as I prepare for our Listen, Imagine, Compose primary project. As part of that, we will definitely need to be using topics as stimulus and starting points for composing, because the idea is that we fit in with curriculum, and a lot of schools work in a project-based, topic-based way. And so when I've worked in primary and I've done CPD, teachers have absolutely jumped at these ideas of connecting science and music. So two recent examples. One, so about 2 weeks ago, did a music maze workshop. Music maze workshops for 8 to 11-year-olds. They're usually live and for a whole day at the CBSO Centre, but I've been doing them digitally recently. And the piece that we were exploring was called Ripples in Space-Time 2, which was by a Chinese composer called Jie Guoping. And he had taken pulsar signals from this massive 500-meter telescope in China. It's called Fast China. And he had used the acronym of the name to create a musical code, which was notes. And then he'd created ostinatos, repeating patterns using these notes to kind of represent the sort of background signals. And then within his music, he actually has 3 moments, I think it is, where you can clearly hear the pulsar being discovered. So you've got this kind of background noise of all these layered ostinatos, and then out of that texture, you suddenly hear these repeated pings, which is the pulsar coming round. And the children really grasped that idea, about these sort of the idea of signals. So there, I suppose we're really looking at, I suppose we're using music to describe things there. And the signal at the kind of very smallest unit, the signal is this little pattern of notes that is repeated. And then another experience, a recent experience, is I did some CPD in a school not so long ago for the whole school, and I said, challenge me with some interesting topics and see if I can make up some composing activities you might do with your school. And I think the year five teachers gave me digestion, which was fabulous. Well, I wanted a challenge, and the wonderful thing is that there's this brilliant composer called Shiori Asui. She's quite interested in, I'm not saying that scientific things, but climate change, the body. She's very interested in turning found sound into musical sound. And in this piece, it's for a string ensemble. It's called Digestion, and you can absolutely hear the food being digested. But it's such a wonderful metaphor. It's about metaphors. So much of this is about metaphors. So with the digestion, if you imagine a musical idea as a bit of food, and the food goes on a journey upon which different processes are imposed upon it. So it travels down, it is fragmented, it's pulled apart by the stomach, it's squashed, new agents of chemicals are put into it which cause change, etc., if you like. But so you've got to, so the science can offer these wonderful structural metaphors, it can generate little small ideas, it can generate how a particular idea is transformed. And so this works really beautifully in primary schools, because that's how they're working. In some schools, of course, you've got music being taught separately, and that's on its own kind of trajectory, which may or may not connect with other elements of the curriculum. And then, of course, I'm then, when I've got, as you say, I've got a lot of early years experience. What I think is where you see the connections there in a way is different, in that it may not be different for the teachers, but for me as a musician in that space, it's about children as experimenters, and that in musically might be a child playing the same pattern over and over again on a drum and then playing it slightly differently, or accidentally hitting something and then trying it again and then actually purposefully hitting it to create the same effect again, or experimenting by playing on the underside of the instrument, but that repetition with small changes, and it's a very creative thing that's happening, but it's also a very scientific thing, because outside there's a ramp. This is me imagining it, but this is sort of what's going on. There's a ramp with a car, or there's a tube with a ball going down, and they're trying different cars out. They're trying, the children are moving the tube up and down, or the slide up and down. They're making these little tiny adjustments, and so it's that sort of repetition, which is exactly the same which has been going on with the children and their exploration of the musical instruments. And me as a musician as a play partner and a musical partner, I'd be picking up on those minuscule moments of change, And so if I musically replied to that, I would make sure I noticed that change and I honoured that change that they had made. And that would often then encourage them to make either to repeat the change or to make another change. I'm not quite so sure how that is supported in the science, but I would imagine that the teachers would maybe provide new objects, provide a different kind of ramp, provide another material, next day set up a different kind of space. But you can see so the connections are about the children's play. And I suppose if you're working in very child-centered learning spaces, as I was as an early years musician, you see that through the children. But once you're, I suppose, in your primary school, the teachers are deciding on what's being learnt, and therefore you're almost kind of you're needing to engineer those connections to be made somehow. I mean, my son's 6, and everything seems incredibly siloed as far as I'm concerned at the moment, having now seen a lot more of what he does. Or I suppose this is my other sort of, I suppose, not necessarily at my son's school, but what I see is it's only done on a really surface level when the arts and the sciences are brought together. Okay, so we're doing a topic about space. Let's listen to the planets, and let's now compose our own pieces of music to describe the planets. And I don't think that is quite a descriptive, thematic way of connecting music with the science. Something like the project I described with the pulsars. Mm-hmm. You're really thinking about the science and the processes and what's going on structurally, rather than just, oh, let's make a piece about the planets. I'm quite interested when the music is more used to explore the actual processes that are going on within the science, rather than just describing something.
I think the other thing that you mentioned as well, which I've been thinking about a lot myself, is that notion of real world. So when you were talking about the early years practice that you've explored, it's about they're experiencing everything in the real world. Everything is connected. There isn't the differences between science and music. They're experiencing it at the same time, and they're offered that opportunity and time to do that in the early years kind of practice. Whereas, as you say, in primary, then learning becomes more structured. So there is a difference, and actually it'll be interesting over these discussions that I'm having with lots of people to figure out, well, how far should things be structured, and how much space is needed for child-centered exploration, how much is guiding too much, how much time is afforded for all the other kind of creative processes, or the time to really think about those connections between something like music and science, rather than, as you say, music feeding the science or science feeding the music, but a combination of the two. So that would be, I think that notion of real world is something that I'm going to take away from this, about thinking about that notion.
Because I think the work has to be meaningful for both sides for it to really work. And so, where am I going with this? So there has to be learning in the science, and there has to be learning in the music. And of course, my interest is in composing. So what is it about the composing that I structure that would enable the children to both learn about the science, but also to learn some really interesting ideas about how they might play around with musical ideas? And then for the science, and then the science, it's really, if we come at this from a different angle than teaching the children scientific facts, if we find a way for them to express these scientific ideas in other mediums, that will enhance that learning as well. I mean, the whole kind of, Reggio Emilia, 100 languages, it's just, and it's really in my head at the moment. in terms of visual art, actually, because again, just going back to my son at the moment, he doesn't like doing writing at all, but he will draw very detailed pictures and tell you all about what he's thinking, and for him at this moment, that is his language for communicating about what he's thinking about the world. And I think maybe art has a slight head start because you can actually see it, and with children, if they're trying to kind of express what they're learning about the world in sound, it's often kind of dismissed as noise and interrupting what's happening. So yes, I would love to get to a space where there's just much more meaningful connection between both sides, and that the kind of there was really authentic learning going on for both subjects, not one or the other.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end this discussion, and leaving this discussion on this notion of meaning making and authenticity for young people. Thank you so much, Nancy, for joining me for this conversation. It's been really insightful. And if people want to find out more about BCMG and the work that you're doing, they can go onto the BCMG website. And there's lots of projects that are going on and lots of activities that people can join with their young people. That's correct, isn't it, Nancy?
Yeah, absolutely. Not all the projects I've described are up there, but there's a lot of projects, and particularly there's a lot of resources there at the moment for learning at home. And yeah, it's been lovely talking to you, Victoria, and remembering the project.
Indeed. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you.
Thanks.